All right, welcome back. In this one, I wanted to talk about marathon pace training. When runners talk about marathon training, the conversation usually starts with how much mileage you're doing, what's your long run, and we can go down that boat really, really quickly. But one of the things I think is important is understanding the purpose of marathon pace and how to use it. If you haven't seen my channel before, I'm Brant Stachel, former national team coach. I've coached athletes in the marathon from 2:15 to 6 hours, and I'm starting to share some of that training and insights for everyone else. And hopefully, you get to learn a lot as we go. And so, this one, marathon pace. So, let's define what we mean by marathon pace first. And I know that sounds simple, like, of course, it's the pace you run a marathon in. Yep, I get it, but we have 10 billion languages in running here in our ecosystem. So, I want to just describe it like I did easy pace in my previous video in terms of all of us being able to understand on the same page what we mean by that. So I come from a little bit more of a Daniels based system, so he would call that M pace or marathon pace. For those of you who are lactate, 2 to 4, give or take, depending on the person, heart rate 80 to 85%, give or take, some fluctuations depending on the individual. 5 zone model, we'd be looking at zone 3, Borg, RP scale, 13, 14, 3 zone model, lower zone 2. So, that's the kind of gambit, depending on the training plan or program you're using, that you might hear some of that terminology. And so, what I think, if I explain this from like a Daniels perspective, is that most of the time what we're trying to do is we're going to build the system of training around specific targets, right? So, like I said, those are all the other ones we have. I'm going to use M pace or marathon pace in this for this discussion. And so I would look at it and go, it's the sweet spot between easy running and threshold running. So it's enough to stress the aerobic system, but it's sustainable enough to practice true endurance. And so when we look at what it actually is, I think the first caveat is that it needs to be the marathon pace you're currently in. This is the mistake I see happen all the time with marathoners. To say, I want to run a 4-hour marathon, I want to run a 3-hour marathon, I want to run a 2:30 marathon. Therefore, they go and run their marathon pace at those speeds, even though they have no proof that they're actually in that shape. They just like the shiny object of the goal. And so I think the first piece we need to do is we need to choose a race result that's fairly recent or a good performance in a workout, and we need to go to the VDOT tables and we go, okay, what is the likelihood within a couple of the VDOT values of the marathon pace you can run? And then we want to look at, okay, how does your training skew? Do you skew a little bit better towards the shorter stuff? Do you skew a little bit better to the longer stuff? What's your volume and what's the likelihood that you're going to be able to sustain that performance over 2.5, 3, 4 hours, etc. Right? So you can do that off heart rate, but that doesn't, really calculate into peripheral fatigue and a bunch of other factors. That's why I like the Daniels perspective. And so, as I said, it sits just below threshold. So you're working, but you can still have good form. You can still control your breathing. And so it's a pace physiologically where you can train your body to burn fuel efficiently and hold rhythm under mild fatigue. And so one of the things that's important to know is, even Daniels said this himself, there's not much physiologically that you'll actually get from doing marathon pace to make you a better runner that you can't accomplish through tempo running, interval running, long runs, etc. However, for most people, and this is where you see a little bit of the divergence from the elites to us, age groupers and such, is that this gives us a lot of time practice our fueling, right? Practice being out there for a long time, practice being in our mind with a grind for a long period of time. And I think it's very crucial, if used appropriately in the build, to understand what your pacing is going to be on race day. Without these, it becomes really hard to do. I have seen marathoners, and there are some elite marathoners that don't do much marathon pace. You can consider, people who live at altitude. They don't do true marathon pace, what they would actually run on the day because they're at altitude. That said, a lot of people who have success in the marathon have bouts of straight marathon pace or broken marathon pace in their long runs in their builds. And so, yes, the other stuff is important. You can't just do, marathon pace runs. But I would argue that if you don't do them and you remove them from the plan, especially big ones, and I'll explain how I do that later, you're at a huge detriment when you show up to race day and you have no clue how to pace on race day. And so, going back to the physiology of it, it's kind of like to simulate, it doesn't, improve per se, but simulate the metabolic cost of the marathon without the destructive fatigue of racing the full distance, right? So we're practicing economy, we're practicing fueling, we're practicing patience, these are all the cornerstones, of marathon performance, right? We oftentimes say that the marathon is a thinking person's event. You have to be very, very patient. And this is why a lot of track runners sometimes when they move up from the 10 or the half don't do as well at the marathon, because when that happens, right, and they're impatient, they tend to bonk a lot earlier. right? And so let's talk about another piece that kind of goes hand in hand with this for marathon pace runs. I like to cap marathon or all long runs roughly 230, 245, depending on the person. But I never run that much continual at marathon pace. I think it's a lot. I think there's, diminishing returns. I think there's a huge injury cost that goes up with this. And so I would rather you be, in your mind, I don't think this is true, but in your mind, slightly underprepared because you didn't hit 20 mile. And I've done a video on why the 20 miler is this myth that we don't actually need. But I'd rather you feel like you're underprepared than get injured, right? And so looking at that 2.5, 245, depending on the person, right? How do we break that down to have marathon pace? So when I program, I like to do some form of marathon pace, or you could, think of the idea of some of the Canova in and out stuff in and around marathon pace in his percentage-based system every second week. So I think that allows you a good balance of recovery for, out of a marathon pace session to do a tempo or an interval session midweek, and then bounce back and do a long single easy run to get some of that aerobic stimulus that you need, for the marathon. And so when I look at those, it would be, blocks of 20, 30, 40, 50 minutes, all the way up to the, the big workout that I'll talk about later in the video. But, if you look at it this way and you integrate them in there and you're diligent to just be in and around marathon pace, whether you're using zones, lactates, whatever, right? You are capable of getting the training benefit, right? Increasing the fatigue, but decreasing injury risk. Where most runners go wrong when they attempt marathon pace stuff, as I said earlier, is they attempt best day ever marathon pace. Or they're out there and they go, oh, this feels too easy. I'm going to push because I think if I push, I'll get more benefit. And I see that trap. I understand it because it's like, oh, if I push harder, I'll feel like I've gotten more. If I run faster, it'll be easier on race day, etc., right? But the problem is that's a decision made in a vacuum of what's going on in that moment. It doesn't consider in the fatigue you're coming into that with, the breakdown and fatigue that you're going to come out of that, and what that does to your next workout. So what a lot of people end up doing when they do marathon pace is they end up yo-yoing their weeks in terms of good workouts, bad workouts, because they push too hard. So remember, the purpose of marathon pace isn't to necessarily push your fitness or prove that you're fast. It's to develop and practice in that zone, in and around that pace, right? The second mistake I see is people not navigating marathon pace appropriately with the conditions that are happening. So if it's hilly or, it's windy or it's hot and humid, they go, well, this is the pace, so I have to do it. And it still feels relatively easy because remember, it's not tempo, it's not threshold pace, right? But it, again, has that knock-on effect later in the week. And if we look at proper marathon training and the integration of marathon pace runs, we want consistency over a long period of time. So anything that degrades our ability to be consistent over a long period of time is going to be detrimental to our marathon race day success, right? So this is why nailing the marathon pace run is crucial. And this is why oftentimes people going over 2.5, 245 with a lot of intensity end up feeling really great in the middle of their build, and then they get flat and taper off towards the end of the build and they don't feel as great on race day. And so, if you can think about it that way and have control, remember we talked about the marathon being, patience, right? And planning, right? Those are super, super helpful. The second piece that I want to go into is what it actually means to do marathon pace and how that feels. It should feel relatively easy, right? It's not hard. Tempo running should also feel relatively easy because it's roughly the pace you could do for about an hour. I'm going to do a video on this next. But, it shouldn't feel like you are dying, right? Think about it this way. If you are doing a 5K pace workout and you are doing 1K at 5K pace, and that feels unsustainable past the 1 kilometer, then you're training to the workout rather than training to the race that you're trying to do. And so in the same way, if you look at marathon pace and it's a 20-minute block, 30-minute block, 40-minute block, and you're pushing because you have this idealized pace that you want to hit, right? And it feels unsustainable. Well, what do you think is going to happen on race day, right? You can't will your way into that being easier, right? And so when we look at proper training, it's patience. So with that, I want to give, I don't like stock plans. I'm really against it. I think training should be individualized, but I want to give some example workouts that I use with my athletes here and highlight why I think they're, of importance for you to navigate and look at, because I think this really will illustrate why this idea of controlled, marathon pace and alternating is really helpful. So when I'm coaching marathoners, I operate on a week and a B week. So a 14-day cycle rather than a traditional 7-day cycle. So in week A, we'll have a midweek workout. Maybe it's a tempo run, maybe it's interval pace, depends on the person. And then we'll have a marathon pace or broken marathon pace workout within the long run on the weekend, right? So the first week, that might look like, 60 to 70 minutes at marathon pace, 20 to 30 up, 20 to 30 down, right? Minutes, to be clear. And so we do that, and we don't do miles because the body knows stress and the body knows time. The body doesn't know miles. 8 miles is different for everyone, so we're not controlling the stimulus. But 60 minutes or 70 minutes for everybody is the same type of stress, right? And so if we look at 60 to 70 minutes and why I like this at the start of the build, it's because it gives you a good idea of where you're at. It gives you a good idea as you get into the build about what might be appropriate and what isn't, right? It's a long enough go that you're kind of tired, but if you go too hard, it's kind of hard to do, right? So that first one gives us a really good building block, right? So coming out of that, we might do a tempo or interval session midweek, depending on what it is. And then we might do a long run, 2 to 2.5 hours. That's kind of all we do. So I like to recycle that 14-day cycle where there's an A week and a B week, and we distribute the marathon pace every second week. From there, depending on how the athlete navigated that one, what their experience is, we might move into some more marathon pace total time, right? So we might do something like 2.5 hours where we alternate 30 minutes easy, 30 minutes marathon pace, right? We might do things where we do 2 hours alternating 5 minutes marathon pace, 5 minutes e-pace, a little earlier to the middle of the build, just to get into it, a little grindy effort as you go through, right? And then towards the end of the build, and this is the crucial workout that I really, think shows everything about how the build went. Usually do this about 4 weeks out. We do 90 to 100 minutes at marathon pace. And why that's important, that time frame is for a lot of reasons. But if you look at what we've done in builds all the way across, we generally haven't gone over 90 or 100 minutes of total marathon work in a single bout, right? But what we're trying to do is, we space it out early on in the build and we kind of bring it together. So we have this peak here 3 to 4 weeks out where we're really doing 90 to 100 minutes. And when we do that, we find, okay, you're not going to get much more fit in the last 2-3 weeks anyways, right? So we want to have this as a test. This for me, I call the dress rehearsal. So I want you in your race shoes. I want you your fueling protocols, everything, right? When we do this workout, you will find out a lot about your readiness for race day. So if you are trying to run, 3 hours, 4:15 Ks, right? If you get done that workout and you don't feel like you could go another half hour, 40 minutes on the day, might not be the race pace, right? So, 4:15s, that's going to get you what? Just over 21, give or take K, right? 13 miles. I'd rather you find that out 3 to 4 weeks out and we reassess and shift the goalpost a little bit for what your goal is, then find that out 13 miles on race day and either drop out or struggle home, right? I would rather you navigate that and change the pace to 3:05, right? Then go into a race with something where you are not ready, you are not capable of running the pace and having a horrible experience. And so this workout becomes crucial in all my athletes' builds. And once again, you can see even with that kind of, max 100 minutes, 20 up, 20 down, we're not going over that 2.5 hour range, right? And the athletes I've worked with love this workout. The athletes who have done multiple builds are waiting for this workout because they want to know and have that confidence on race day that this is exactly how they need to go about hitting the marathon, right? And so another piece about why we don't need to do 20 miles. I've done a video on this, but I'm going to keep harping on this because I think this is something we need to be, destroyed on. And so I don't hear any elite athlete say, well, I had to hit 20 miles at marathon pace or 20 miles in the long run to feel confident, right? And so when you look at 20 miles and you look at some of the athletes I coach that are, 6 hour, 5 hour, 4 hour marathons, right? Let's look at the 6 hour one. So we're going to ask them to be out there for like 4 hours, right? That's a giant amount of stress. I've never heard an elite athlete be like, you know what? I definitely want to go out for 4 hours. Right? Why? Because they know they'll be injured, right? And so why would we want people getting into the marathon for health, for enjoyment, for chasing their own excellence to be in a build and get injured or potentially have a high likelihood of injury multiple times that we wouldn't give to elites, right? Like just because somebody's faster doesn't mean that we should treat slower people completely different and make them do longer and increase their risk of injury, because that's a very simplistic view of looking at marathon training for them. This marathon might be what's getting them into training, but it might not be what keeps them in training if it's done correctly. And nobody runs their best marathon in their first one. So let's train them to have a successful, healthy build. It might not be as fast as they want per se, but decrease the risk of injury, increase the likelihood of success, so they keep coming back and getting better and better and better. And so I'm going to keep hammering home that this 20-mile thing needs to go. As I said in my other video, it's a USA based thing. I don't see this around the world, but it needs to end. So let's wrap this up here a little bit. Marathon pace, training teaches your body and your mind to run for a long time at that pace, at that effort, right? So if you can do that in your training, you have a higher likelihood of being successful. That A week, B week that I like to use, especially for newer runners who don't have that intensity tolerance or potentially the discipline, allows them to space it out, because we know that consistency is going to be the best thing they can do to be successful in the marathon. And so if you do that week after week, you build exactly what the marathon demands: durability, efficiency, and confidence. I hope you enjoyed this breakdown of marathon pace training. Please check out my video on easy runs. It pairs perfectly with this because these are the two bedrocks for marathon success. I'm going to be doing tempo pace and 5K pace and continue on this series. So hopefully you will stay and watch them all. Thanks.